Hi there, this is Mrs. Meek, and today we're going to start our biochemistry unit with a review of atoms, elements, and compounds. All right, the overarching idea here is that matter is composed of tiny particles called atoms, and this is all matter, including biological or organic matter. All right, so chemistry is typically where you study matter, and you've probably done that in your integrated science class. All right, but we're going to review just enough so that when we start talking about biological reactions, you can understand where and why things are occurring. All right, so atoms are the building blocks of matter, and atoms are made up of three main parts: neutrons, protons, and electrons. Protons are the positively charged particles, and neutrons are the neutral particles. Both of those make up the nucleus. And then outside the nucleus, we have these electrons that are negatively charged. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, the nucleus, the very center of the atom, consists of the protons and the neutrons, and the electrons are moving around in these orbitals that we also refer to as energy levels. All right, the atom consists of equal numbers of protons, which are the positively charged particles, and electrons, which are the negatively charged particles. Therefore, their overall charge is zero. All right, elements. Elements are any substance that cannot be broken down into any other substance. So it's broken down as much as we can into a pure form of the atom. All right, they are made up of only one type of atom. There are 100 known elements, 92 of which are naturally occurring. All right, scientists have organized these elements into a table which we call the periodic table. The horizontal rows are called periods, whereas the vertical columns are called groups. And if you remember, they have organized these elements in the periodic table in order to show certain relationships. And one of those relationships is that the group of elements located on the far side of the table, those are your noble gases. Some of the other information that they typically want you to pull out in a chemistry class is that your metals are any of these in the blue. All right, and so on and so forth. So when you read the periodic table, all right, the actual symbol is in the very center, all right, and that typically is the first letter or first couple letters of that particular element. So the symbol for carbon is a uppercase C, and the number right above it is called the atomic number, and that refers to the number of protons in the nucleus of the atom. All right, so the atomic number refers to the number of protons, and that will also be the number of electrons if the element is not bearing a charge. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. All right, the number underneath the symbol is the atomic mass, and that is the mass of the actual nucleus. If you remember, the nucleus is composed of the protons and the neutrons. Therefore, if we want to know the number of neutrons in an atom of carbon, we would have to subtract the atomic mass, 12.0112, minus 6, and we would get specifically 6.0112 neutrons. All right, this also brings up some important information that we're going to definitely talk about much later in our biology class, but just to mention it here is the idea of isotopes. Atoms that have the same element but different number of neutrons are called isotopes. All right, so they have the same number of protons and electrons, so there's no charge on the atom. All right, but the number of neutrons in the nucleus can change. So a carbon-12 nucleus has 6 protons, 6 neutrons. However, a carbon-13 nucleus still has 6 protons, but now 7 neutrons. And then we also can have a carbon-14 nucleus, which will have 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Why are we talking about this? Why is this important or interesting? Well, scientists have identified certain isotopes that are radioactive, which means they can decay in very calculated amounts. And we know the time period that it takes for half of the carbon in an organism to decay, and we can determine the age of that potential organism. So for example, if we find a bone, we want to determine what time period it was from, so we can identify maybe what animal or organism it was from. A scientist would determine, first of all, what the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-13 and carbon-12 are in that sample. All right, so all living things produce carbon-14. So if we know how much carbon-14 and how much carbon-13 and 12 is available in a certain sample, we can determine how long ago that organism died and what time period that organism was living. All right, so compounds are a term that we give a substance when two or more different elements combine. All right, compounds all have chemical formulas that are fixed, so it's a very specific combination, and it's a fixed ratio. For example, water, which we call H2O. All right, 2 hydrogen to 1 oxygen molecule, that is what makes up water. If we had H3O, that would no longer be water. All right, we cannot break the bonds between the atoms that are making up the compound. We cannot break those physically. All right, we can only break those chemically. All right, so talking about compounds, we now need to talk about the different types of chemical bonds. All right, the electrons are what is involved when chemical bonds formed. And once again, the electrons are the particles, the negatively charged particles that are moving around outside the nucleus, and they travel in those energy levels. Those that have only partially filled energy levels are not very stable. So those electrons want to react with other electrons in neighboring elements. So that is oftentimes how chemical bonds will form. So let's take a look at the first type of chemical bond, which we're going to discuss, which is called a covalent bond. All right, so covalent refers to the idea, anytime you see this word, this prefix co, all right, that means they're going to share. All right, so covalent, the atoms involved will share electrons. So it's a chemical bond that forms when electrons are shared. This specifically creates a molecule. So any elements that combine in a covalent bond are called molecules. All right, so this once again is water. We have our oxygen atom and our 2 hydrogen atoms. All right, we will at some point talk about the 2 types of covalent bonds, which are polar and nonpolar. All right, but for now, you just need to understand that covalent bonds, electrons are shared. All right, our next type of bond that we talk about is an ionic bond. And this is a kind of bond that forms when 2 oppositely charged atoms, which are now called ions, all right, come together, and the electron from one atom is actually pulled into the orbital of the other atom. All right, so sodium here has 1 electron in this very outer orbital. That makes it very unstable. So oftentimes that electron will cleave off of the actual sodium atom. And then that makes the sodium have a slightly positive charge, and then it becomes an ion. All right, our chlorine atom is missing. So in order to have a nice full orbital, which makes atoms really happy, in order to have a nice full outer orbital, this chlorine atom just needs 1 extra electron. So it will oftentimes pull in that electron from that sodium ion, and now we will form an ionic bond, and we form sodium chloride. All right, so that's common table salt, but it forms an ionic bond in which the actual electron from the sodium is pulled into the outer orbital of the chlorine ion. All right, so any type of atoms that come together and form ionic bonds are called compounds. All right, so previously anything in a covalent bond we called molecules. Things in ionic bonds are going to be called compounds. All right, compounds tend to dissolve very easily in water, and there are a lot of them present in living things. Sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride. All of these ions help to maintain homeostasis, and they're important because they can transmit signals, and these signals are what your body uses in order to carry out all of your senses of your five senses, the sense of sight, taste, hear, feel, smell. These are all able to be perceived by your body because of these ions that are present in your body. All right. Lastly, I just want to bring up one last type of attraction between molecules. So we talked earlier, molecules are involved in covalent bonds in which the electrons are being shared. All right, oftentimes these covalent bonds can be polar, and what we mean by that is there's slight areas of positive and negative charge. So for example, on a water molecule, where you have your oxygen atom, you experience a slightly negative charge, and then where your two hydrogen atoms are, there's slightly positive charge on that molecule. All right, that allows that molecule then to be polar, so it's a polar covalent bond. All right, and that resulting molecule will be able to have slight reactions so that oxygen from one water molecule will be slightly attracted to the hydrogens in a neighboring water molecule. And this is interesting because this allows certain molecules to form matrices among themselves. So water, this is one of the very unique properties of water. So water, because it's polar, has a polar charge, a polar covalent bond, all right, it allows it to display things such as adhesion and cohesion, which allows it to be chemically sticky with other water molecules or with other molecules that may be dissolved in the water. This is also the property that lends itself to surface tension, and we're going to talk about this later on in our study of biochemistry. Thank you. Have a good day.